In this episode, the featured film tells the story of a young woman with a beautiful dream, describes a world that is designed to prevent that woman from achieving her dream, and softens the societal message of this story with unforgettable song after song after song. These stories and more from the 22nd row. My Fair Lady was released in 1964. The setting of the film is London, England. The time is around 1912, 1913. Now, England at this time had enjoyed, if that is the correct word, about 70 years of relative calm and relative prosperity, most of it during the reign of Queen Victoria. And our story, our film My Fair Lady, takes place right at the end of this period and just about a year before this seemingly limitless world that was going to go on forever was about to explode like the rest of Europe when the Great War began in 1914. So for now, our story, is a snapshot of a world that existed just before this catastrophe occurred. Now, I saw My Fair Lady in the 1970s when I was in university. And by the time I saw it, I was very much a movie fan. I very much was in love with musicals. I liked the story a whole lot. It has a lot to do with language, and I was a literature major, and so that was kind of something I was interested in. But I just fell in love with this movie at the time, and I couldn't believe how talented all the people connected with it were. And one of the things that movies have done for me over the years is they've opened doors. Watching films has opened doors for me like history, literature, a greater appreciation of the arts, etc., etc., etc. So when I saw My Fair Lady a couple of times, I had heard or read or something that it was based on a play written at the turn of the century called Pygmalion by a fellow named George Bernard Shaw. And when I took a look at that, I learned that an earlier version of this story was made into a film in 1938, and that the play and the film were actually adapted, I think is probably the best way to describe it, from a story from Greek mythology some 1900 years earlier. So I was very curious, and I decided to check out what that was all about. 1900 years ago, when the play was written, 1900 years before this play was written, there was a story in Greek mythology, as recounted to us by Ovid, whose works have somehow survived through the millennia, about a sculptor named Pygmalion. Now, Pygmalion had had a rough time with the ladies. I suppose he was rejected. That led him to detest women, hate all their natural and normal imperfections, just like the rest of us have. And he decided, as a sculptor, to create his own woman, a woman that he could fall in love with, theoretically. So apparently he was a well-renowned sculptor, and he started to do this. And day in and day out, he worked on this sculpture using ivory. And eventually he came to the completion, and he fell in love with his sculpture. And everyone in this village in the island of Cyprus thought that he had done a terrific job because the sculpture of this beauty was indeed beautiful. He fell in love with this sculpture. He touched it, he caressed it, he tried to kiss her. But of course, he wasn't stupid. He realized that it was made of stone and it was cold and there were no feelings to be shared. He could love this woman, but this woman could not love him back. But for him, for the time being, perhaps seeing himself as the eternal bachelor, it had to do. Well, in Cyprus there was annual festivals, or maybe more than annual festivals, to the goddess Venus, the goddess of love. And what would happen is at these festivals, the lovelorn partners or whatever would pray to Venus and ask her to fix their problems, whether it's relationships or whatever issues they had going on in them. They would pray to Venus to help her solve their problems or make their relationships better. They would often offer up sacrifices of goats or something for this. So Pygmalion did the same thing, but of course he didn't have a relationship. So he prayed to Venus and said, "Could you please find me a woman as beautiful and as alluring as the sculpture I created?" Now, Venus was a goddess, of course, and sometimes the goddesses were, and gods were in a foul mood, but on this occasion she was in a pretty good mood. And so the story goes, she decided to do something about it. Now, instead of finding a suitable woman for him, she decided to turn the statue into a real person, to bring it to life. So Pygmalion goes home, and as is his usual thing, he caresses the arm of the statue, and he discovers that the touch is far more warmer than he's used to. It isn't as cold as what stone normally is. And then he caressed her a little more, gave her a hug, and he felt the warmth throughout the entire statue. And he thought, well, this is very odd. And then, of course, he couldn't help but kiss the statue, as for whatever reasons he was wont to do. The lips were soft and welcoming, and suddenly the statue's eyes opened, and looking into his was this woman now alive, and it was his dream come true. So Venus had gone one step more than he could have thought imaginable. The woman came alive. She saw this wonderful new world and her partner Pygmalion, and according to the story, I guess they lived happily ever after. And sometime later, I'm told that other classical writers said that he named the statue Galatea, but it wasn't in the original story, whatever that's worth. So that's a charming story. Maybe like most Greek mythology are either charming or brutal, but this one was utterly charming, of course. So 1900 years later, somehow Ovid's many of his stories in the Metamorphoses survived this massive amount of time. An Irish playwright called George Bernard Shaw, who was a societal activist, a political activist, but a very renowned playwright and very popular in his time, decides to adapt this story in a tremendously clever way. He wanted to make a commentary about the world in which he and everybody else lived in at the time, and so he wrote a story about a professor of language who decides to sculpt an existing woman into another woman, into a different woman. And so the idea was that whereas Pygmalion had the gods provide him with, by giving him life to his statue, here it is, a man of letters, an academic, would take a woman from the gutter, from the curbside gutter, as is mentioned many times in the play and the movie, and turn her into a lady, and maybe pass her off fraudulently, but doesn't matter, pass her off as a duchess. And this was the play Pygmalion. Well, it was very well received. Shaw had a great run, so I've read, to about 1895 to 1925, with several very well received plays. But eventually, with the advent of the talkies, in 1938, a movie was released called Pygmalion. And in fact, George Bernard Shaw wrote the screenplay for this film. And I hadn't seen this film at all until recently. I knew it existed. It's one of those movies that's hard to find because the prints are generally poor, and maybe there's some copyright issues as to why they've all fallen out of use. But I had the occasion this past week to watch it again, and it's a terrific film. I like it very much. And because I've seen My Fair Lady many times before this film, as I was watching this film and recognizing how the scenes were almost identical again and again and again, I kept waiting for its male lead, Leslie Howard, a terrific actor, by the way, who died very young. Audiences might know him as Ashley Wilkes from Gone with the Wind. And the film introduced a female lead, Wendy Hiller, who was Eliza Doolittle. So I'm watching this film. I said, wow, I've seen this before. And I kept waiting for Leslie Howard and Wendy Hiller to start singing. But of course, they don't sing in this film. It is not a musical. It is a very strict adaptation of the play, not surprisingly, because George Bernard Shaw wrote it. So the only downside to this was I saw this movie on a very reputable streaming service last week, And the quality of the print was poor. The sound was poor, and that's disappointing, and it's never a good thing to try to introduce viewers to a film they may not have either heard of or seen and find out that it is just of poor quality, and that's a shame. But it is a really good film. I really enjoyed the film. I liked it a lot, and I could see how I couldn't see how, but given a really talented songwriter and musical person could find moments in this film to turn it into a musical. Now, apparently it took, there were many attempts at turning Pygmalion into a musical. Why people thought it was perfect for a musical, I don't know, but they did. And some very famous people thought it couldn't be done. But in the late 40s, early 50s, a rather successful pair of songwriters and musical people by the name of Alan J. Lerner and Frederick Loewe did succeed in turning Pygmalion into a stage play musical called My Fair Lady. And it was an immediate success, a tremendous success. And it starred Rex Harrison as Professor Henry Higgins, the academician. And it starred an actress named Julie Andrews as Eliza Doolittle. So this film was very successful. Sorry, the stage play was very successful, and there was a deal in that a movie could not be made of this play until the play had run its course, however many performances that the people who owned the rights to the play decided was enough. So that ended about 1962, and that's when the movie started to be made. Now, there's a lot of noise about My Fair Lady, the movie, a lot of noise written, and I don't care about it. Down a certain road, it's kind of interesting from a trivia standpoint and from all the kerfuffle that surrounded this film. I don't really care too much. The bottom line is the movie was made. Rex Harrison reprised his role as Henry Higgins, but the female lead went to a very famous actress at the time, an actress we have seen before in this series, Audrey Hepburn. We saw her in Roman Holiday in her supposedly inaugural film, when she was, I think, around 25. And now we see her 11 years later as Eliza Doolittle, and the pairing is nothing short of magical. So that's the history of going from 1900 years ago, with Ovid recounting the tale of Pygmalion the sculptor, 1900 years later to George Bernard Shaw taking this piece of mythology and adapting it and twisting it and turning it to shape his desire to make a commentary about social mobility in the time he lived, and ultimately someone else about 40 years later deciding that this was a musical waiting to be made, and it was made, and the result is our 1964 version of My Fair Lady. Just a spectacular film, and since I've seen it again this week, I've forgotten how much I love this movie and all the songs in it. So My Fair Lady is a musical. It's got approximately 15 numbers in it, all of which I love. Most of them are incredibly memorable, and moviegoers and people who like music probably know at least one or two of the songs, if not 4 or 5 of them. But the movie also contains a very soft-pedaled social commentary. And this was very prevalent at the time that the play was written. And that is for the first 150 years of what I call the modern world, which sort of coincides with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in England, let's say, or the time of Queen Victoria, let's say around 1837, 1840. Where you were born was pretty much the kind of life you were destined to live. If you were born, of course, as an aristocrat or of the nobility, that was a no-brainer. You would have that kind of life. If you were born a pauper or amongst the peasant class or lower class, it was almost impossible to move out of that life. Now, maybe with the passage of some years and the growth of some form of middle class in Europe, people who own things, maybe shops, maybe bigger shops, and ultimately landowners who maybe got involved in mine ownership, you acquired money, and so you joined the level of the middle class, but by and large, where you were born, that's where you stayed. So I think Shaw posited the possibility of how could you move up in the world? How could you better your life beyond just getting a little bit more money? Because so much of the lower classes, if we focus on Great Britain, eked out a living day to day, hoping to make money off of these aristocrats and nobility class who had to buy food, and whether it was flowers and dresses. There would be amateur dressmakers, maybe not really specialized dressmakers. So they lived off the benefits they could get from this upper class. So doing better than that would have been extremely difficult. So what Shaw says in the play is, through our Professor Higgins, that upward mobility was a possibility. Now, making a lot of money, maybe people got lucky. There were a lot of things already invented by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So it was difficult to see how a lot more money could be made, but more money didn't necessarily guarantee upward mobility. But what if you spoke better? Now, of course, in Great Britain, all the natives spoke English, some better than others. What would have been called originally the Queen's English, then the King's English, and now after however many years of Queen Elizabeth, we're back to the King's English again. There are all kinds of accents. If you know anything about England, there's so many dialects of how people speak, and it pretty much places you into a social class. Now, all of Europe has had a class structure for probably hundreds of years, but nobody did it as well as Great Britain did. Their class structure was ironclad. You had royalty, culminating with a king and queen. You had dukes and duchesses and earls and barons and all kinds of things. Even a song in My Fair Lady says, "Every duke and earl and peer is here." There was no difference in the rest of Europe. There were upper classes, aristocrats and nobility, and then much lower classes to the level of peasant class. And everybody knew their place, or at least they were expected to know their place. And never the two would mix, except for in a market or a place where goods were bought and sold, but certainly not socializing. So what would allow someone to move up the ladder? And the theme of the movie is, what if they spoke better? What if they didn't speak in the language of which they were born into, whether it is slang English or very accented English, or at least not the King's English? This is a very interesting concept, because if you don't speak like what you're born into, then how do people know, unless you wear the clothes, exactly who you are and where you're from? And I've had friends tell me that when they went to England, people would always try to identify who they were. If they were going to school there and they were from this sweet old country where I come from, which has a very North American accent, they couldn't quite place them. And it was really important to these Brits. It turned out to be either Oxford or the London School of Economics, where some of my buddies went to. It was very important to them to find out what your background was. So I think it's still true in England to this day. But certainly in 1914, everybody had to know their place and stay in their place. So the major theme of this film is, what if someone tried to move up that social ladder just for the only way that they could find that was possible, and that was to improve the way they spoke? And I think it's a fascinating theme, and it's dealt with throughout it is the central theme of My Fair Lady. And it's done so not in a harsh way or a really activist way, because of course it's a musical, but it's always there in the movie, and it's dealt with humor, it's dealt with joy, a little bit of sadness, and I think that's what elevates My Fair Lady beyond just a terrific musical, because I love it as a musical, to a really fun story to follow. So I want to skip over the play My Fair Lady and talk about our movie. And the reason I'm very comfortable doing that is because I read that of all the plays that have been adapted to the screen, there may not be a single play done adapted more directly to the screen than My Fair Lady. Allegedly, every scene in the play is in the movie. Every song in the play is in the movie. And the only difference were some of the actors were the same and some of the actors were changed. So let's talk about our movie, My Fair Lady. As I said, we begin with a glimpse of the upper classes. They're at a play or perhaps a concert of some sort in a very fashionable, almost palace-like building. And they're exiting the street. And on the street are people of the lower classes, extreme lower classes, who might want to sell them a flower or some fruit, sell them anything where they could get a few coins in return for their wares. And this is how these people eked out a living. And that's about the only time that these people would intersect with this upper class. Sometimes they're called invisibles. I would have been one of the invisibles if you knew where I was from. They were, as a rule, undernourished, dirty. They didn't bathe as much. They lived in very squalid settings, this lower class, this street class of people. They probably had little or no education, maybe just a few years of education. It was a very, very difficult life for this lower class. Not a middle class, but a lower class, the street class, as Henry Higgins calls them, the curbside gutter snipes. Not a particularly nice way to describe them. We find our leading man, Henry Higgins, outside of this theater, and he's writing things down in a notebook. And the streetwise guys notice this, and our heroine, and in fact the absolute star of this film, star in the sense of the story revolves around her, is the flower girl Eliza Doolittle. She's yakking away trying to sell her flowers, and one of her buddies says, "Look out, there's a cop writing down everything you say," and she gets really mad. Now it's interesting that they decide that the professor is not a cop because they look at his shoes. And here again is the costume of people that they wore that would indicate what level of society they were from. And the character says, definitely not a cop, because a cop wouldn't wear shoes like that. So that's kind of cool. So she ends up talking to the professor, and they have an exchange and a little bit of screaming and yelling. Eliza's a very emotional young woman. And the professor bumps into another gentleman, obviously aristocratic, and they start talking about language for various reasons that the movie explains. And Higgins, who is very much full of himself, very self-contained, very sure of his skills, says that he could take this curbside gutter snipe of a woman and pass her off as a duchess if only she learned to speak better. And they say, "Oh, well, that's kind of interesting. Oh, what a novel idea," et cetera, et cetera. And there's a first song in the film, very important to the story, because this song tells about what Henry Higgins is all about and what he thinks about language. So it's very well timed. Song 1, we learn about Henry Higgins. Full of himself, super confident, definitely aristocratic, but maybe a black sheep in that world. And they walk off. Now, Eliza may be like hundreds, I don't know if there were thousands, probably, thousands of street people who eked out a living on the street and off of the coins tossed at them by the upper classes. And they were all, as I said, probably poorly educated, malnutritioned, dirty, all the same, except our girl Eliza is not the same. We find out with the next song in the film that she has a dream, a very powerful dream, a beautiful dream of being something other than what she is, or living in a world other than the one she lives in. And so that sets Eliza apart to some extent from her brethren and sisterin, because she's a dreamer, and she's got the strength of a street person who, if they survive, they have to be tough. And we learn through this song what it is that she's looking for in life, the life that she doesn't have now and may never have. So beautifully the movie sets this up. We've got our male lead, our aristocratic linguistics professor, who boasts of turning a street urchin into a duchess. And we have one of these street people, our flower girl, who wants to be something more than what she is. And after she sings this song, we realize that Eliza has an idea in her head. She's not stupid. She's definitely not educated, but she's not stupid, and she thinks about something the professor said. And so the very next day, she tracks down the professor at his home, and she says in a very fun way that she's willing to pay for lessons to make her speak better so she can work in a flower shop or something like that, where she could never get that job because she don't speak properly. And there's the start of our story. It's a fantastic premise. The aristocratic friend, whose name is Colonel Pickering in the movie, he says to Higgins, well, this is almost irresistible. Can you make this boast come true? And Higgins thinks about it and he says, what a chance. I have a captive audience. This girl has nothing, no family. She is at the lowest level of society. So if I contract her, in a sense, to stay with me for 3 to 6 months and I teach her how to speak, will I be able to change her life? So what a terrific premise for a story. We're all cheering for Eliza because we love her to death. Already we love her to death. And it doesn't hurt that this dirty, malnutritioned woman happens to also be quite gorgeous in her own right. And so the story is set up to tell us what happens as Eliza reluctantly agrees to go on this voyage of learning, of trying to become something that she isn't, of trying to move up that social ladder when all of society says that you are not allowed to do so. You were born into that life and that's where you belong. Higgins, despite his arrogance, despite his bachelorhood, despite his hatred of everybody but himself, more or less, although he professes to be the nicest man you would ever want to meet, he is the vehicle by which she can advance because he rejects society. His society is his, and he doesn't care about anybody else. He says he treats a duchess like a gutter snipe as much as he treats a gutter snipe like a gutter snipe. One of the key elements of the film. So at this point we hear two more songs, one from Higgins about why he's not a big fan of women, why he is a confirmed bachelor, and how he has no interest in Eliza and for any other reason other than to turn our statue into Galatea, to turn her into a lady. And so we have a terrific premise for our movie. We have many more wonderful songs. I mean, wonderful songs. My own bias is, as I said before, everybody can sing, just like me, but I don't sing well at all. And so I have an astonishment and respect. I'm in awe of people who sing so beautifully. I have a tremendous respect for people who can write such terrific songs, both the music, where the melody stays in your head for 50, 60, 70 years after this movie comes out. I remember many of these songs very, very well. And so that's one of the reasons why I love this film. The music is so good. The songs are so well timed because they describe the characters, they deepen the characters, give us a greater understanding of the characters. There's even a tangential element, which is Eliza's father, who is a very self-professed ne'er-do-well and very happy about it. But he has two of the most famous songs in this movie. One is called With a Little Bit of Luck. With a little bit of luck, they get through their squalid existences. And the other one is I'm Getting Married in the Morning. Now, these two songs have lived on since this movie incredibly well, and they're just really entertaining asides, for the most part, to the story at hand, although there are some elements of the songs that help move the story forward. So I just found that at this point, roughly maybe 10 or 15 minutes into the film, a 3-hour film, that it's just spectacular. That we want to find out, will he do it? She speaks her accent is so thick, her imperfect grammar is so imperfect. Is it really possible? For anyone who's tried to learn a second language, assuming that they only have one to start with, and once again, I'm also in awe of people who are bilingual or trilingual. I don't care if they were forced to become bilingual because of where they grew up, or their parents, first generation parents, might be from a foreign country and they come to an English speaking country so they can speak Italian and English, French and English, Hindi and English. I don't care. The fact is, if they can put two languages in their head, I have tremendous respect and awe for anyone who can do that. And Eliza's learning to speak from speaking poorly to speaking very well is almost the same ladder that she's climbing. And it is a very difficult one, and there's no guarantee they will succeed. In fact, Colonel Pickering and Higgins make a bet that he can't do it, or the bet is to encourage him to work very hard to do it. And of course, Eliza has to work 100 times harder to do it. And so that is the spine of our story. We follow her along. There's some terrific moments where there are successes, undeniable successes, a spectacular song to celebrate one of those successes, and then there are the story or the message or the theme of the movie takes over a bit, and it asks the question, well, if we take a street girl, a curbside flower seller, and turn her into almost a duchess, and then they're finished after 6 months with making her a duchess, what happens? Does she return to the street? She definitely isn't born of noble birth or aristocratic birth. Have they ruined her life by making it better? And this is a very important question in the film and drives the second half of the film and makes it, I say, you just can't stop watching it start to finish, not only for the music, but also because the story, I think, is so good, and perhaps it's my own bias that I love anything to do with language. I have a social consciousness like most people do, and I'm very curious about what it would have been like to have been born into that class at the turn of the century. What it would have been like for me to have been born where I was in the 50s, to be born 50 years earlier, and what my life might have been like. So that's the setup, and that's the story of My Fair Lady. So with all movies that have a great script, a great story, great potential, in this case, terrific songs, casting once again is critical. Now, it just so happened that the 1938 Pygmalion starred Leslie Howard, as I mentioned, and Wendy Hiller. And Leslie Howard was a terrific actor in his day, in the years of the 30s, made several really good films. As I say, he's probably most well known for Gone with the Wind as the Southern man Ashley Wilkes. And unfortunately, he died early in an accident, maybe not an accident. I think his plane was shot down during the beginning of the Second World War, where 14 other people died. A tremendous tragedy. There were children on the plane, wives of people, a mix of people involved with the British government. So that was a tremendous tragedy, of which the Second World War has no shortage of stories about those tragedies. Wendy Hiller ended up having a terrific career, was in many wonderful films. She was in a film I like very much that was very well received, called A Man for All Seasons. And then she played an 80-year-old, but she was only 60 years old when she made a film that I'm going to talk about later called Murder on the Orient Express. So that was, as I mentioned, Pygmalion of 1938 was a very enjoyable film. So here we've got The Sound of Music following on a Sound of Music. So here we have My Fair Lady following on a terrifically successful play. And so we got to cast these roles. And as I say, the real center of My Fair Lady, the real cornerstone of the film that has to be done right, is Eliza Doolittle. And there was a different actress for the play who was very successful, but Henry Higgins was played by Rex Harrison in the play, and he played it in the movie. And Rex Harrison is, to speak of him just for the moment, is one of those people that I also am in awe of. A voice that's classically trained, of course, but goes beyond that. His whispering is as compelling as his strong voice speaking to the end of the theater as his screaming. I just don't know how it is possible for someone to have such a terrific voice like that. He looks aristocratic. He has that screen presence. He had a very terrific career. He played Higgins perhaps a bit like himself, because he was reputed to be very full of himself. But at any rate, he had perfected the role on stage and does a spectacular job in the movie. I just can't imagine anyone being better than him or doing a better job than he did. It's just magical. But as I said, the key person is Eliza Doolittle. And for whatever reasons, Warner Brothers, who were responsible for this film, hired Audrey Hepburn in this role. Now, by the early 60s, she was a megastar. She had made several terrific films in the 50s after her initial film, A Roman Holiday, which I spoke about in an earlier episode. And there has been a lot of noise written about this movie. So much noise, I don't care. I don't want to read anymore. I've read some, heard some. Who cares? Audiences 60, 70 years later won't know about any of the things that they talk about or care about it. All we know is that Audrey Hepburn is on screen. She looked like a street urchin, although you could tell that she has a very classically attractive face. She also has a terrific voice. She was a trained dancer in real life. She had the good bones to be attractive. In fact, Henry Higgins says, you know, when you look at you a certain way, I might almost call you attractive. Yes, I might almost call you attractive. So Audrey Hepburn was attractive. And so she is the perfect street urchin to be sculpted into the Duchess. And I think that she is spectacular in this role. Could other actresses have done a great job? Probably. I'm sure they could. I'm sure the actress from the stage, Julie Andrews, could have done a spectacular job as well. But we have Audrey Hepburn in this movie, and she is wonderful, and we love her from the first few scenes we see her, and that's really critical to cheering for her to achieve her dream. And dreaming is so critical in this movie, and wanting to be something bigger than what she is, more than what she is. And so that casting was absolutely bang on. Forget the noise, forget all that's written. If we just look at the film, Rex Harrison and Audrey Hepburn work, and they work spectacularly well. Now there are a huge cast in this play, of course, lots of minor roles. Stanley Holloway plays Eliza's father, and as I said, he has these unforgettable songs and moments that he has in the film. But there's one other lesser star in the movie, or role, that I want to mention, and that is a character who falls madly in love with the improved Eliza. Even though he saw her once when she was a flower girl, he sees her in a very different frame, sees her in a very different status later in the movie. And he has this absolutely lovely English name of Freddie Eynsford Hill, who's a bit foppish, a bit of a ne'er-do-well, but with lots of money, or at least his family has lots of money. Perhaps a very stock character in English stories. But Freddie is madly in love with Eliza. And Freddie is played by an actor named Jeremy Brett. Now, the reason why I have a real soft spot for this role in My Fair Lady and for the actor is because 20 years later, give or take, Jeremy Brett, I believe, was the definitive Sherlock Holmes in a television series made in England, which was based directly on the stories from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And I have yet to see an actor do a better job than Jeremy Brett did as Sherlock Holmes. If you get a chance to see any of the stories in the series, and there might be anywhere between 10 and 20 episodes in total, maybe 15, he is, if you think about Sherlock Holmes, if you know anything about Sherlock Holmes, he seems to me to be the reincarnated Sherlock Holmes. So I watched the series in the 80s, and then I watched My Fair Lady again. And so that guy looks so familiar, and it turns out it was Jeremy Brett. And he does what he has to do in this movie quite nicely. But I have a soft spot for him because he's my Sherlock Holmes. So all in all, the casting was terrific. This was a very important movie at the time. It was important for Warner Brothers, and it really was critical that they get it right, because as it turned out, a few years later, they made a movie from another very successful play, a musical, and it was a flop. It did not do well. The critics were savage. I've seen the film. I don't mind it too much. It's called Camelot, but the stage version had Richard Burton as King Arthur, the same Julie Andrews as Guinevere, and Robert Goulet as Lancelot. And the people they got for the roles in the movie just couldn't match their talents. They are three of the most spectacular stage actors, and from Burton's standpoint, superstar. And even though they tried to replicate the success of My Fair Lady, the movie was a tremendous success, it didn't work. So it isn't automatic, it isn't easy, and full marks to the people behind this film, however many people from the director on down, Warner Brothers staff, that they didn't tinker with the story from the play, and they put together a fabulous movie that I just enjoy watching again and again and again. My Fair Lady is a musical, and I have always loved musicals. I don't know why. I'm a student of literature. I love reading books. I love reading history. I love movies, private detective films, whodunits, police procedurals, biographies, histories. Very early on, I really got to enjoy musicals, as I've already described one, Singing in the Rain. There's so many more in the golden age of Hollywood, before and after. And My Fair Lady, I think, is the beginning and the end of the great period of Hollywood musicals. Yes, there were more musicals made after 1964, some of them very well received, but I find not quite in the same way, with about 15 terrific songs in this film, songs that most of the songs people who see the film never forget. It might have been the last hurrah for the great Hollywood musical, and it definitely went out with a bang. So the songs are both memorable and they are inserted at exactly the right times. We want to know more about Henry Higgins? Well, here's a song about him loving the bachelor life. We want to learn more about Eliza? Well, here's a song about her and what she dreams about and what she wants to be one day. Perfectly timed. We want to see Joy, and we see and have her express her happiness at whatever success she's having as she goes on this journey of learning how to speak better. There's an absolutely unforgettable song that Eliza sings for that situation. Near the end of the film, there are more songs throughout the course of the film, but near the end of the film, with all the conflicts and the pushing back and forth, and Eliza trying to find her way in this brave new world that she finds herself in, or almost in, and rubbing up against Henry Higgins, who is arrogant, very aristocratic, and even though he's a bit of a mean guy, this is a musical, this is a soft movie, and the audience has to like him, and it's good that Higgins he starts to change, and there's nothing better in a movie that near the end of the film we see that there's a softening of a position, and he sings a song that I remember when I watched this for the very first time. And what's going to happen? What's going to happen? We're at a point of no return where Eliza has made a decision and Henry's made a decision. And he sings a song, and the song comes right from a line from the 1938 version of this film, the film called Pygmalion, where Leslie Howard is walking down the same sidewalk that Rex Harrison as Henry Higgins does 25 years later. And Leslie Howard says he's quite content with what's happened, but he says, "I've grown accustomed to her face." And of course I hadn't seen Pygmalion, but then Henry Higgins is walking down the sidewalk and he's railing about how happy he is the way things turned out, however they turned out. But then he says, "I've grown accustomed to her face." And he sings this song. And it is important to note that Rex Harrison was not a singer, a big baritone or the voices that the other actors have in the film, but he sings it like someone who speaks as perfectly as he does. And the songs are designed to be sort of spoken, half singing, half speaking. And for me, it was just magical. And every time I see this movie, as I do with so many musicals that I like so much, and this song is so perfect, so advances the story, even near the end of the story. It's so touching, it's sad, it's beautiful. The hair stand up in the back of my neck, and I could watch it again and again and again. And so the music of My Fair Lady is absolutely central to the storytelling. It's central, I think, to its success, and it helps us think about the theme, the questions asked in this movie, without it being too serious, without it being too preachy. It's such an enjoyable experience that we can say, hey, that movie was about a lot of things, wasn't it? My Fair Lady is second to none when it comes to the songs written for this film. And I would hold it up against any of the musicals I like, and any of the musicals that are revered throughout the period of Hollywood and beyond. It's just a job extremely well done. Not exactly a contemporary of Shaw's, but about 20 years earlier, there was a very famous playwright in England, and his name was Oscar Wilde. Had a wicked reputation, but was a very talented playwright, very clever man, a brilliant man in my opinion. Wilde has a quotation that I think of often, and that quotation was, "We are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars." And I remember the first time I read that quotation, I thought that was just magnificent. How we aspire, most of us, to bigger and better things. And I think completely apropos to our story, My Fair Lady, where Eliza isn't literally in the gutter, but she is looking to the stars, looking to a better world, a different world, hopefully one that will make her happier, healthier. And I've thought of that quotation many times. So we went from Ovid 2,000 years ago to George Bernard Shaw 1,900 years later, to the movie Pygmalion 30 years after that, to the stage play My Fair Lady in the early mid-50s, to the movie My Fair Lady throughout this journey. Even though I am not quite in the gutter, I continue to look at the stars from the 22nd row.